So I'd like to start while maybe some people are installing FIJI or getting this sample data set to just go over what ImageJ and FIJI are. So ImageJ is a open source imaging, image analysis solution, primarily provided by the NIH. And it is a tremendously versatile platform. So there are a lot of different plugins available, and it's likely if you have a specific question on how to do something on it that someone has already solved this particular problem. And that's what makes it really useful. Now, FIJI is very similar to ImageJ. It is actually the same program. What FIJI is it's ImageJ with a bunch of extra plugins. And it's sort of the name FIJI itself is a joke. FIJI stands for FIJI is just ImageJ. So I prefer FIJI a lot because it comes with a bunch of plugins that are very useful, particularly the bioformats plugin, which lets you import images from almost any microscope you could think of. There are some exceptions to that, but in general, it's pretty good. It also, by default, comes with the ability to access more of the computer's RAM, which can be useful if you're looking at large file sizes. So today we're going to be looking at some kind of basic things in FIJI to get you started on image analysis and also kind of how to prepare an image to put in a figure. The next time we'll cover some more in-depth topics about quantification, but for today I want to make sure we can open images, look at them, do some adjustments to color and brightness, set a scale, get a scale bar in, do some basic, very basic measurements, and how to look at 3D stacks from confocal. All right, so let's start with opening images. So I've got a whole set of different image types that we can open. So if we look at FIJI itself, which is up here, we get just a bunch of menus, file, edit, image, process, analyze, plugins. Today, we're going to be primarily sticking with just the edit and image commands. The most basic way of opening an image is go file open. But this has some pretty severe limitations. You can open TIFFs with it or some very basic file formats. But if you want something proprietary, it's much better to use the bioformats plugin. Now, this will automatically get activated if you drag an image into FIJI. So I'll show you an example of that. This is a CZI file, so it's from a Zeiss confocal. I'm just going to drag it in. And this bioformats import options dialog will come up. 90% of the time, you don't need to do anything in this manager. You just hit OK. And the file will open. In this case, we have a multicolor image stack. It's a stack. There's one channel. There's a second. There's a third. Can also open this LSM, so older format. This opened with the colors already in. You'll find that specific coloring for confocal may be incorrect or slightly not what you want when you open the files. We'll go over how to fix that later. This one is an ND2, so this is from a Nikon. Again, this is just another stack. Two color in this case. This one is from a Leica confocal, and these open a little bit different. So again, we have this dialog, we hit OK. The Leica files, your whole session is kind of stored in a group. So you can select from that session which images you actually want to open. So in this case, you just check whichever ones you want, and then hit OK. And it will, in this case, these files are a bit larger, so it's taking some time. Each of the image sets will open in its own window with a different name. I'll draw your attention to this console that opened up. So this is Error Console, and you'll see this sometimes when you're importing images. Basically, FIJI is just telling you here that it doesn't understand something in the metadata. In this case, it doesn't understand that these images have some deconvolution in them, and it has an immersion value and a correction value. It doesn't know what those mean. It's not a problem for an imaging perspective. It just means it doesn't understand. All right, so what if you have a format and it just isn't opening correctly at all? One option is to take it from the microscope or the software that's attached to the microscope and export TIFFs from that. So TIFFs can be opened by almost anything, and including FIJI. So here I have an example of that. This is just a set of TIFFs from a confocal stack. So to do that, we go to File, Import, and we would pick Image Sequence. And then we would pick the folder where these files are in. Let's see. And then we would just hit select. Now I'm going to just have it go and open all these images. I'm going to tell you it's going to generate an error. And I'll show you how to fix it. All right, so here's our stack. And if you see, it's kind of flashing and it's different colors. And this is because we actually, if we look at these TIFFs, things are exported in multiple channels. So this isn't really an ideal situation, but there is an easy way to fix this. So what we want to do is look at the file names. Let's see. And we just want to see what differentiates them. So if we see here, we have different channels. So we have a Z and then a C. The C is just a channel. That's pretty common for any TIFFs that are getting exported. They'll be slightly different depending on who makes the software, but it's more or less the same. So if we open the same, go to the same folder, and what I'm going to do here is there's a filter. So I can use the filter and say it has to contain C2, for example, and then hit OK. And now we have a stack of just that C2. Now we could go through this and we could get each channel this way and then combine that into a multi-channel stack later if we wanted to. All right. Let's see what is next. Let's look at metadata. All right, so let's look at the Zeiss data. Sometimes it's important to understand something about your acquisition. It could be what lasers were used, what the scaling is, how to reproduce what you've taken. So we can look at that. There's a function for this. Under image, there's show info. And this will give you a tremendous amount of information. It is not ordered or organized in a way that makes a lot of sense. But if you need to find something, you can, which is the important thing. So we have some very basic information in the beginning, sort of that we have 3 channels. This is the how many pixels wide and tall it is, how many Z steps there are. There's no time steps. And if we look through here, this is every little variable that the microscope has for acquiring. So if you were curious on what laser was used or what laser power, what detectors, what microscope this was taken on, these are things you could figure out. And then we'll do brightness, contrast, and then we will see if there's any questions after that. So let's look at another stack. And so one thing you often want to do is adjust the brightness contrast of images. So if we open this stack, I'm just going to put it in the middle. This is the Z slider here. This is the channels. We'll go over that in more detail later. What we want to do is image, adjust brightness and contrast. This will bring up a window that looks like this. And what we have here is the histogram. So this is showing the brightness of all the pixels in the image. And essentially, we want to make sure that we are accurately representing what we have. So right now, we are showing the full window. We could adjust this two ways. So you can directly adjust brightness, contrast. Brightness will make it brighter. Contrast kind of increasing the contrast kind of increases the change between pixels, decreasing it decreases it. And you can see up here that it's affecting this line up here. So this brightness affects where the line is, and this is the slope of the line. And that's essentially what we're actually looking at. Now, I don't find the brightness and contrast themselves particularly useful. I would instead do minimum and maximum. So set where the minimum is based on kind of your pixels. So, and also some knowledge of what you're looking at. And the maximum should usually come down to where your acquisition is brightest. Now, there's a lot of caveats to this, and it's important to understand. If I take my maximum and I bring it way down here, I'll get a really bright signal, but now all the pixels that are greater than this are all going to be the same value, and it'll be very difficult to interpret your data. Similarly, we want to be careful about not hiding things. So we could take our minimum and bring it way up here and only see part of the data. This is probably not a good idea. What you typically want to do is adjust the brightness contrast based on some controls you have. Alternatively, if you just want to quickly look at it and you don't care too much about it, if you hit auto, what it will do is base the minimum and maximum just on the histogram. So minimum is the lowest value read, maximum is the highest. And that's typically a good spot. Now, we can do a couple other things here. So right now, this brightness is affecting the image we're looking at, but we haven't actually modified the image. So if I were to hit apply, I get a warning. This warning says that the pixel values will change if you click OK. This means you are actually actively modifying the image. So you want to be sure that you want to do this. Alternatively, if you just want to look at things in FIJI, you can just do these adjustments and close this window, and they will stay on the screen. However, when you save it, unless you're opening it in FIJI again, it will not have changed anything. Now, let's go over what I would do if I wanted to do a pixel adjustment. So the first thing I would do, and this is for almost any adjustments at all, so go to Image and Duplicate. In this case, we will duplicate the entire stack. We'll go through this a bit more later. But basically, whenever I do any modifications, I always duplicate. That way, you still have your original. You can go back to it if you want. And now I can adjust these values to whatever I want them to be and not worry about it too much. So I'll hit OK. So now this one, if I save it, these pixel values are now whatever they are. And we can see the histograms have actually changed now. All right, so now.
We have one question on that topic, if I can jump in with that. Laura, I'm just going to read your question from the chat, but please speak up and elaborate if you'd like. Laura asked, if you change your min-max, does it have to be the same across all samples in your data set? Same question for brightness and contrast.
So yes, you should absolutely change them all equally. It would be dishonest to change some a different way. The only exception I can think of this is if you acquired your data not using all the same settings, which it in itself is a bad thing to do. But yes, you should apply these settings equally.
So just to clarify then, for each channel, you would need to optimize like the min and the max, and then across all samples, set them to the same value. Yeah,
so you would actually read these values here. So for an example, this red channel, if I were to set this like this, for example. So our minimum is 16, our maximum is 31 or 3,194. So you'd want to set that for all your samples. You'd probably want to open all your samples at once too and verify that this is a good brightness contrast for all of them.
Great, thank you.
So there may
You have
be,
one more question. You want to do it now, or we're going to do a pause in a minute?
let's do it now.
Okay, Jerome has his hand up. Jerome, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, so it's not too much of a question. It was just more to expand on the question that Laura asked, and I think that you touched on it. I'm sorry, the individual that is actually doing the demonstration, like I know you said to open all of them, and one of the things that I do specifically for my images is I will open up all of them, and I will specifically look at my positive and negative control. And I actually modulate my max and min according to my positive control and then hit propagate to all open images. So that way I'm going on ahead and doing that. Is that appropriate, or do you have a better way to do that?
That's a good way. Using your a positive and negative control are really the best ways of setting these.
Yeah, and I was going to elaborate on that from what Laura was asking too, and what Evan said. I mean, really, you're not, you're going to adjust your min and max, but it's not just how you feel that day. You need to have some data from a negative control or something to kind of figure out what your background really is and what you're really capturing. You want to figure out what that background is from measuring something else and then set it for your actual test cases. All right, one more question from Megan. Does pressing auto change the min max for every channel or just the one you're currently viewing?
Oh, it only changes the current one you're looking at. So that's very important. You'll need to go through each channel and do them individually. And the reason is that each channel is kind of independent from one another. They're not acquired with the same settings, so it's really inappropriate to make some global adjustment. Each channel will need its own.
Right, and I guess people probably understood this, but to the same question about doing it across your data set, you don't want to pick your min max for green and then apply it to your others. Those need to be chosen separately as well.
I have one other thing to show for brightness contrast. So sometimes you'll have really bright things or maybe really dark things in your image, and they're not things you even care about. And they will greatly affect this auto button in particular, but also just your general analysis. So sometimes you only are interested in one area. So up here, we have a bunch of different shapes. We have a rectangle, oval. This is like an arbitrary polygon and more of a rounded structure. For this purpose, I'm just going to use the rectangle. You can draw a shape, go back over to your brightness contrast. And this is the histogram just within this box. So we're ignoring everything outside there. So we can get an auto on that, or you can adjust it however you want. But there's a really important thing here. If we hit apply with this box right here, it will only apply this change to within the box, which is typically not what you want to do. So in that case, I would click outside, anywhere not in the box to get rid of it, and then hit apply. All right. Are there any more questions on brightness contrast?
There are none in the chat at the moment, but if everyone would like to raise their hand on anything we've covered so far.
Okay, I think we'll move on then. All right, so next is bit depth. So bit depth has to do with how the data is stored in the data files itself. So if we go up here to image and type, it'll tell you what type it currently is. So this is a 16-bit image. Now that means it has a certain number of channels. You can actually see it typically in the histogram. So this big number here is the maximum channel that this image has. So if we have a lower bit depth, so I'll convert this to 8-bit. We've gone from having that several thousand channels to 255, because that's the maximum. Between 0 and 255 is the maximum an 8-bit can have. So in general, the 16-bit kind of gives you more options for doing brightness contrast adjustments. But sometimes you need your file size to get smaller. And this is a really good way of doing it. Going from a 16-bit to an 8-bit will usually about half the file size. Typically, you would do this after you've done all of your other adjustments if you were going to do it. You would certainly not open your file, convert it to 8-bit immediately, and then do a brightness contrast adjustment. That would not be appropriate. Similarly, other things that are not appropriate, going from a lower bit depth to a higher bit depth. You can do it. FIJI will let you do it, but essentially you are making up pixels when you do that. It's not real. And it's largely inappropriate. We'll cover a question in just a second. There's some other options in here as well. So these are 8-bit color and RGB color. So right now, if I save this image, FIJI will understand the colors and some other microscopy programs will understand it. But things like general image viewer will not actually have any color to it because the pixels are just stored as brightness. They don't actually have any color associated with them. We save it as an RGB color, which is something you would only do again when you're kind of near completing on your image. Then you could open it in a different program and it would show up just fine, like Windows Viewer or just photos on your phone or something like that. So I think I can take that question now.
Thank you so much. So I was just curious if you could expand a little bit on why it would be inappropriate to open the original file you received from the scope and immediately convert it from a 16-bit to an 8-bit.
Sure. So the major reason is that we have this histogram here, and I'm going to reopen this because we manipulated it too much. All right, so if we look at this, we have, in this case, 4,095 channels of brightness. So that's different bins that we're looking at. So all these different levels that we can see here. If we immediately converted this down, we would have to kind of average a lot of these channels together to get down to that 255 number. And because we're averaging channels together, we're losing information. It doesn't always matter. Sometimes you have so much brightness or a difference in contrast, it makes no difference. But it's usually a good idea to not reduce your information till you're kind of near the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so then I guess to expand on that just a little bit, I'm assuming that the image that you are currently using has multiple channels in it, such as 48, 568, 647. But if we save our images according to their respective channel, so one image specifically for 488, one image specifically for 568, etc., then is it okay to open that original image, immediately convert from 16 bits to 8-bit, and then start the manipulation, keeping in mind that we are keeping the original TIFF file that we received from the scope, etc.?
So from a data integrity perspective, that's completely fine. But I would still probably not convert it to 8 immediately. I would do the brightness contrast adjustment first and then convert to 8. That way you have a little bit more control. If I do this conversion right now, FIJI is going to decide the brightness contrast for me. It's going to collapse this histogram. Let's see if I can show this in the red channel. So right now our histogram, most of our signal is right over here. And that's fine for right now. If I convert this to 8-bit, the histogram is still over here, but we went from having several hundred channels to 34. And that just leaves a lot less ability to manipulate. Now, if your signal is really good and everything looks great on your images, it's likely to not make very much difference. But really the only reason to convert to 8-bit is to save space. right. Let's see what's next. Oh, cropping duplication. Okay, so these are super useful. Cropping. So I've got 3 examples for this one. So these are 3 very similar images. So we can do a couple things. I've already showed duplication once, but before you do a manipulation, it's a good idea to do this. Now, if you haven't saved the image, you can always go back and get it again, and that's no problem. However, it can be a little bit quicker to just duplicate, try something. If it doesn't work, you can go back to your original and duplicate it again. But duplicate has some other features too. So let's say I want to only look at this region here. One option would be to crop it, which is image crop. However, right underneath it, I have duplicate, which will produce a new image that is the cropped version from this one. And that way, if I decide that I didn't like this very much, I can drag this window a little bit, duplicate it again, see what I like better. Now, there's some other things that we can do with this that I find particularly useful for publication. So let me make these a bit smaller just so you guys can see. So all 3 of these are the same thing. They are just imaged with different types of contrast. And let's say I want to produce a figure showing the exact same spot in each of them. Let's say this spot. So this one is fine. I've already got it drawn. So I can just duplicate it. And now I have that one. Now this one, if I want the same area, I could try and draw another square and try and get the exact same spot. But it turns out that there's a function to do this. So we go to Edit, Selection, and Restore Selection. It'll produce this exact same square in the exact same spot. I can duplicate that. Put that next to it. And similarly, complete the set. So I find when I crop one image for a figure, I want all the cropping to be equal. And for that reason, I find this really useful. You can just open the whole set of images you want for the panel, crop the first one, and then use this restore selection. Now, the restore selection basically produces the same square or ROI that you've produced on a pixel value in the same location. Now, if you don't want it, if you just want the same size, you can use the square tool and just drag it around to where you want, but now it's in a different spot. Looks like we have some more questions.
Yeah, we have a question from Juan.
Hey, Evan. Thank you so much for the talk. I am a little bit, I think you already moved on, but I noticed that whenever you exported it as an RGB color, you could only find the exact same slice that you were on.
Yeah, that was a bit of a mistake I made. It will do the whole thing.
Okay. I was wondering how did that happen?
I think it's because I applied something to a single slide, likely because I had a square in it.
Okay.
So if I have that same thing open and go to RGB, so here you see convert to RGB.
Okay.
Slices. So as long as you have that checked, it'll do all.
That will work.
And then I'll keep source just so you're not ruining the original image.
And I do have a question on the topic that we're right now. I noticed I'm still not super sure about where to click and then to click back. So how does FIJI know which selection is it pulling, or is it mapping from into another image, right?
It'll be the last kind of box you've interacted with. So whatever the last box was. So I'll put this one here. I'm going to get rid of one of these. So let's say I want this here. So I interacted with this box and I go over to this one. And so I click the box or the image I want. It might be a little bit hard to tell over Zoom, but the active one is a little bit like the title is a little bit darker. And then do the restore selection.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Jerome, I wasn't sure if you still have your hand raised or if you had a new question.
Yes, I had a new question. So
Right.
I'm assuming that this workaround is sort of a way to do an inlet without having to worry about going on the scope, finding a specific region of interest, and then trying to go to a higher magnification. You can just look at the image and then do the crop feature and propagate to all samples
Yeah, so
for that specific.
I use it a lot for this. It depends on the resolution of the original image you got. So if you have the pixels available, you can definitely do it that way. So I primarily do electron microscopy, and so we do a lot of tiling. And from the tile data, we actually can produce, really low meg work. And then we actually just end up doing this duplication function to show our high meg insets, because we have lots of pixels available in that case. For confocal imaging, you want to make sure you're kind of at least within the 300 dots per inch, if not 600. Depends a lot on where you're submitting and all of that kind of detail. And we'll probably cover that in the future, I think.
And then with that, if you were to use this as a way to do the inlet, would the new image you created do the expansion of the scale bar to show the difference? Or is that something that you would have to do, like that would take more work, if that makes sense?
So we haven't got the scale bar yet, but FIJI will handle scaling information entirely for you if it already exists. So you don't need to worry about it. So images will always have the correct scaling regardless of what you've done to them, as long as it's there to begin with. These images don't have any scale information to begin with right now, but I think that's the next part. So we'll go over that.
I think you would have to add a new scale bar. It's going to know
It'll know the scale information, but it won't have
just your bar though, right, in FIJI.
because that requires user input to
Right.
like where you want a bar. Yeah, but let's do that now. Let me verify.
I was just going to add one more thing that Evan touched on here, the keep source image and the duplicate. This is a really common thing in FIJI, so that you're not changing your data that you can't get back. So it's just a good habit to be in the habit of always copying before you make your adjustments. And like you can see, like I just said, it might come in two different ways, either keep source or find the duplicate.
Yeah, either is fine. They're basically the same thing. You'll find if you ever get data analysis from me that it will have like a -1 after it. That means duplicate. It'd basically be your image plus dash and then a number. Usually 1, but if it's duplicated more than once, it might be a bigger number. Okay, let's do some scaling. So I have 3 examples here of different ways of determining scale. So let's start with the simplest. So this is an image that came from one of those LSM files. And FIJI understood the scaling already from this one, which is fairly common. If you are opening something that came from a proprietary format, so CZI, LSM, ND2, that kind of thing, it is very likely that FIJI already understands the pixel size in this case. So we can figure that out pretty quickly when we open an image. If we look up here, this is sort of the information for the image. First one is this is 1 of 2. That just means there's 2 channels. In this case, they're both the same because I've combined them. And then the next one is the scale. So we have, this is 134, 135 essentially microns square. And this is how many pixels that is. We also have the bit depth and the overall size. So in this case, we're basically already set. We can just add a scale bar if we want to. So scale bars are under Analyze, Tools, Scale Bar. And that'll bring up this dialog here. So we can do a lot of different things here. First is the actual width of the scale you want. Typically, you want this to be a clean number. FIJI will often put a random number here for, I think it's trying to get a certain scale bar size. This is the height in pixels, so this will make a fatter scale bar or a skinnier scale bar depending on the numbers. You kind of just want a proportional scale bar most of the time. This is font size. We'll get back to that in a second. It's the color. So typically on a black background, you want white, and on a light background, you want black. So this is what a black one would look like here. It's very hard to see. But it just depends on, you want high contrast with your environment. And then down here we have location. So you can put this in a bunch of different preset locations. Lower right is very typical. Lower left, and you also see a lot. You can put them in the upper parts. I typically would not do this. I would actually do a transformation on the image. I can show you guys that in a second, just to put the scale bar on the bottom. There's also a choice for at selection. We can't do that right now, but I will do that briefly. So at selection means that we put a point on the image. Let's say we want the scale bar here. So I've got my point tool right here, and I'm just clicking. Oh, now we got multiple points. That's not so good. Let's see. Shift. We only want one point in this case. I'm going to convert this back. So if we right click this, we have multi-point or point. We just want point. So we go to Analyze, Tools, Scale Bar again. And now it knows that we want it at selection. So if you want to put it in a very specific location, that's an option. The other things, so we talked about this font size earlier. I often hide the text. You can put the scale bar in the figure legend, and that way you don't have to worry about this being visible. Oftentimes when you shrink down these images to fit in a figure, they can get really tiny. This kind of future-proofs it. The other thing that's important here is the overlay. So right now, this is just an overlay image on here. It's not burned into the image, which means we can adjust it later. If we uncheck this, this now becomes part of the image, and that can have some side effects, let's say. So we cannot delete this anymore off this image. We could still, if we didn't save it, we could go back to the original. This is one of those things where the duplicate is a useful feature. We also have label all slices here. This would put that scale bar in every slice in a stack. I would typically add a scale bar kind of towards the end of any manipulations, like even after bit depth conversion, sort of as the last step, and then save it as a separate file with like scale bar in the name, so you know it's there. Let's go over a couple other things. So what if I wanted the scale bar here, but you know, we want to keep it in the corner. So there's a bunch of transformation options here. Under Image, Transform, you can flip something, or you can do rotations. This is probably the preferred orientation that I would use for a scale bar. Something like that is probably what I would use for publication, just because it's a little cleaner and easier to see. Typically, you want your scale bar where it doesn't matter, not in anywhere important. But let's see what happens with the scale. So let's do a duplication. I'm going to duplicate this smaller area. And now if we look at our new information here, this is the width and the height. This is the number of pixels. So all that scale information has been preserved. But let me show you something else. If we want, we can scale the entire image. This is another way to reduce file size if we need to. So we can go to Image, Scale, and we have options for the X, the Y, and the Z. Let's say we want to reduce the X and the Y by half So we went from 512 to 256, probably leave the Z alone. And then we hit OK. We also have some options here to create new window. That just means we're not going to mess with the original. So if we look here, our size information is still preserved. Even though we have half as many pixels, the scaling is still correct. So it has doubled the size of the pixels because we've halved the number of pixels. Now, scaling can be a little bit dangerous operation again. It's something that's very necessary for very large data sets, but at the same time, you're reducing the amount of information available. So you've gone from having higher resolution data to lower resolution. It's something you wouldn't necessarily start with unless you were having trouble with the file size. Let's go through two other ways to add scale in case FIJI doesn't understand the scaling. So here's an SEM image. And here we have a scale bar in it at the bottom. But actually for publication, we always cut this information off. We crop it out because it's usually you don't show it. So in this case, what we can do is read this scale bar. I'm going to use this line tool here. And I've already magnified this a little bit. And I'm just going to draw the line across the size bar. So if you have a size bar in any image, this is something you can do. I'm going to go to Analyze, Set Scale. And here, I'm going to tell it the known distance. So we know from this size bar that it is 5 micrometers. So this is the number of pixels long it is. That's what we got from the line. The known distance is 5 micrometers. And usually your aspect ratio is 1. If your pixels aren't square, then that might not be the case. Then I'm going to click OK. And we're going to see a change up here. So now we know that this has a scaling. So 10.92 by 10.07 microns. And then we could go and draw some sort of rectangle, duplicate, and basically be ready. And we could add a size bar too if we wanted to. Let's say we want a 5 micron size bar. It's a little big, so maybe more like 4. Something like this. Okay, there's a third option. So what if we have an image? This is a TEM image. And we do have a size bar here, but we actually have other information as well. If we look down here, this is the pixel size. We can get the pixel size for almost any microscope. It's in the metadata usually. Usually FIJI reads it on its own, but if it can't, we can figure it out. So we can use this information directly. So instead of drawing that line, we can go Analyze, Set Scale, and we know in this case that 1 pixel is equal to 0.532 nanometers. And I'm just getting this from here. And I can hit OK. And now we can look up here and we see we have the units and everything like that. And again, we could get rid of that information bar at the bottom and put a scale bar in there if we wanted. We probably want something bigger than 4 nanometers. Definitely not 500. Let's see, maybe like 100. Something like that. All right. Once we have these things, we haven't actually gone over saving yet. So let's do that.
We have a scale question real quick.
Okay.
From Ella, how do we know that FIJI has not read the pixel information in the image?
That's a great question. Let me show you. So I'll open one that I know it doesn't have. So when we open it, we can look up here and either it will say pixels or it'll have a unit that doesn't make any sense at all. So right now, this one's in centimeters. This is part of an enterosite. So we know that this isn't 25 centimeters. Let's look at a TEM because I think that one's in inches. So basically, if you see a big unit here, or it just says pixel, then you know it doesn't have scale information. If it says micron or nanometer, you're usually in pretty good shape.
And sometimes if you tried to put a scale on there, assuming it did, it would put it in pixels and it would be a crazy number.
Oh yeah, we can do that too. Set scale, we go here. If we just try and set a scale, this is the information it has. So 160 pixels is 1 centimeter. So that doesn't make too much sense. A quick note about these units. FIJI doesn't care what the unit is. It will just put whatever you want there. So it doesn't know how big a meter is, or a micron, or a nanometer, or an inch for that matter. It's whatever you put here. So if you make a typo, it will carry on that typo and not care about it or tell you, just so you're aware. Another useful thing in this menu that I use all the time, if you have a bunch of images that don't have their scaling, but they were all taken at the same magnification, you can click this global and then hit OK. And every image that is currently open will move to this scale. So it's very useful for the same images. It's dangerous if you have multiple different images open that were acquired with different microscopes, different settings, whatever, because it will give them all a scale, but it may not be the right scale. If you open a new image with this global check, you'll get a warning about whether you want to use the scaling or disable it. I'm going to uncheck it because we want to avoid that warning right now. Are there any more questions about scaling? Okay, let's do saving. So let's just do the most basic of save right now. So file, I always do save as, just as a matter of practice. And typically you're going to want to save as a TIFF in FIJI. That's the most common thing. And it will save this in whatever folder it was last opened in as a TIFF, and it will use whatever bit depth is currently selected. Now, if you are not doing this for publication, but you're doing it for, like a PowerPoint or presentation, sometimes you can get away with smaller files like JPEGs that can be opened on many different things. I'm actually a huge fan of when you're doing animated things using the GIF instead of an AVI. The advantage here is you can put it in your PowerPoint and it will definitely play. You won't have any questions of whether this movie is not going to work or is, but there are options to save as movies too. So you can save a stack as a movie, for example. There's a lot of other options here. Most of them are not terribly useful. On the next workshop, we'll cover XY coordinates, which will be a way of quantifying things, but that's not an actual image. All right. Are there any questions on saving images?
None in the chat. Anybody want to raise their hand? All right, let's go on.
Just a quick note that FIJI cannot save in proprietary image formats. So while it can open a Nikon file or a Zeiss file, it cannot save a Nikon file or Zeiss file. However, the TIFF file has all the same information in it, and it can be opened by a lot of different things, including the Nikon and Zeiss software themselves. All right.
Oh, now we have a question.
Okay.
For single still images in PowerPoint, this is a comment from Ben. I found that PNG to be a good option for conserving file size and having good rendering. Yes, and for being able to open in a lot of things. Thanks, Ben.
Okay. We're on measurements. Okay. So I'm going to use this one for measurements. We're back at our TEM. I'm going to just set the scale quick. 1 pixel is 0.532 nanometers. So we're going to go over a whole lot of other measurements in the next workshop, but I'll show you this one quick because it's pretty simple to do. It's another way you can actually check your scale if you're concerned. So this line tool here, and you can kind of drag it from, different items you want to see. And if we look up here, when I'm dragging it, it'll give you the length. The length doesn't have a unit. It's just whatever unit you have it in. But that's the unit, it's not pixel. It's, in this case, it's nanometer. And if we hit Control M while we do it, it'll actually give us some more information on this. In this case, here's the length. And we can do this a bunch of times, and it will just keep adding to this list. So this is one of the more basic measurements that we can do, but it's a very important measurement. Okay.
Hey, Evan,
Yes.
if the scale is the same across different images in your data set, then when you draw the line in different images in your data set, it'll be the same scale and you can like directly compare.
Yeah, so if you have the scale set correctly in each one, you can directly compare. And that's a very common thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's see. Oh, now we're on colors. Colors are kind of fun.
So Evan, let me just jump in and say we've got 5 minutes. Do you want to do
I
that?
didn't know time flies.
Yeah, or do you want to go ahead and open up for questions at the end?
Let's fly through colors. We'll probably revisit it on the next one.
Okay. And go ahead and start putting your questions in the chat, and I'll do them when we get done with this section.
All right. So sometimes when you open an image, you'll just get the black and white. This is basically the real data because things aren't actually colored when you collect them. The detector doesn't care about the color. You're using a filter or something else to figure it out. So we need to tell FIJI, in this case, what the colors are. So go to image, color. There's a lot of options here, and many of them will produce the right result. In this case, I'm going to go to channel tools and go from grayscale to color. And we can check the boxes and see what they look like. We could change a color to a different color if we wanted with this more. Or we can make a composite, which will overlay all the channels on top of one another. So now FIJI understands these colors. If you want to export it, you have a couple options. You could save it as PNG, JPEG, something like that. You can also convert it to RGB color, which will produce a new image. And if you save this one as a TIFF, it is now a color TIFF. This will also greatly increase the file size usually. So we've gone from 16 megabytes to 21 because now each pixel has color information. Let me reopen this and do this a different way. So instead of that, I could split these channels. Let's go color, split channels. This will take a stack or a set of colors and split it into groups. Now we have 3 separate images. This is also a good way to just analyze things. And then we can merge channels. In this case, it's auto-populating these, but you can pick any of these channels. You can pick to put whatever you want in them and hit OK. Usually I have these things checked by default, create composite and keep source image, and that will do kind of the same thing. Now, similarly, if you have 2 grayscale images and you want to make them color, in this case, this is 2 SEM images, we can open them and use the merge channels, and we can kind of pick what we want to see. Again, keeping these checked. And now we have a color image. And I think because we're running out of time, we'll cover the rest of colors in the next one.